Liebe Genossinnen und Genossen, herzlich willkommen zu unserem Vortrag und Diskussionsrunde über die Rolle der USA. Wir haben bereits festgestellt, dass die Debatte, die wir hier führen, genauso oder ähnlich auch im internationalen Rahmen geführt wird. Und deshalb ist es für uns von großem Interesse, sich die Positionen kommunistischer Parteien in anderen Ländern anzusehen. Und wir freuen uns sehr, dass wir heute Ben Becker als Gast hier haben von der Party for Socialism and Liberation aus den USA. Die PSL wurde 2004 gegründet, kommt eigentlich ursprünglich aus einer trotzkistischen Tradition, die sich aber solidarisch mit dem Realsozialismus versteht und zur Imperialismusfrage einige spannende Sachen beizutragen hat. Unter anderem haben sie 2015 die Imperialismusschrift von Lenin neu aufgelegt mit einigen einleitenden Artikeln zur aktuellen Weltlage. Das heißt Imperialism in the 21st Century, Updating Lenin's Theory a Century Later. Daran hat Ben Becker auch mitgewirkt und ist heute Teil des Zentralkomitees dieser Partei und Editor der Liberation, der Zeitung der Partei. Ich denke, er wird gleich noch ein paar Worte zu seiner Person selbst sagen. Genau, wir sind Max und Simon von der K.O. und freuen uns, dass ihr alle hier seid.
All right, let me start with the English part of this presentation. We're very happy to welcome Ben Becker here. Simon introduced you shortly in German, but let's start this lecture or this presentation with an introduction from your side about not only yourself but also the PSL and where it comes from.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in the discussion here today. We know we're in very perilous times, very explosive times for the entire world, and our organization from the United States is seeking to collaborate and dialogue with as many left-wing forces as we can around the world to help us try to come to some sort of common understanding that we are in a unparalleled, unprecedented moment in world history. And there's no, one organization or one person who has all the answers for what is going to come. And it's only going to be through an exchange of experiences and views that we actually come to that kind of analysis. We know, of course, as Karl Marx said, the point is not simply to interpret the world, but to change it. And so we have a very high challenge, a very big challenge in front of us in terms of interpretation. But ultimately, what should be driving our interpretation is how can we get ourselves out of this mess, a world where there's such extreme inequality, where a few billionaires and now trillionaires control so much wealth while so many children of the world cannot even eat, do not even have running water. I live in New York City, in Queens, which just 2 years ago was the epicenter of the COVID pandemic. And it's amazing to think that 2 years later, over a million people in this country have died. We had a public health system that completely collapsed. We have extreme poverty and homelessness, which is growing by the day here in New York City. So first and foremost, I just want to establish that we are indeed in a moment of grave crisis. And it's in moments of crisis that we have to reach out and find new friends across borders, across oceans, and figure out how other people are trying to get out of this crisis. And so we're very humbled by the invitation, and I wanted to thank you. My name is Ben Becker. I'm 38 years old. I'm a historian by training, and I really come out of the anti-war organizing the anti-war movement of the early 2000s and the anti-globalization movement when I was then just a university student. And in 2004, we started our party, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, really out of a group of anti-war organizers who were involved in an anti-war front called the Answer Coalition, which still exists today. And at that moment, there were about 35 of us. It was a very small organization, 35 dedicated cadres. Our Congress, our founding Congress, was smaller than the room I'm looking at right now. And in the last 18 years, our party has grown quite a bit. And I wanted to say that because in 2004, when we started the PSL, it was seen as somewhat crazy. Only crazy people would start a new communist organization in the United States in 2004. Why? Because it appeared that socialism had been completely discredited. Even in the anti-war movement, you could be against war, you could be against militarism, you could be against violence, but to raise the question that it was capitalism that was driving the war, that the war was not a policy of choice, but actually a systemic manifestation of capitalism. To say that we actually needed socialism and that socialism was possible, these were largely discredited ideas, even in the progressive movement, where people had internalized and accepted that really there is no alternative to capitalism, that socialism had been tried and had failed. And so we started our party on the foundational belief that despite this sort of moment of triumphalism and glory, that capitalism had sort of convinced itself and convinced others that this was going to be this was what the world was going to look like in perpetuity, forever. That in fact the internal contradictions of capitalism would ultimately express themselves in economic, political, and military crises. And in these crises, would again return the concept of socialism as the only real alternative to capitalism. And so even if it seemed that this was the darkest moment ideologically for the left and for the working class, that moment would indeed pass. And the only way to prepare for a new moment when socialism returned with mass interest was to start trying to build a party then, even at the hardest moment. And I think that we've largely been validated in that prediction. That for many years we focused really on anti-war and anti-imperialist organizing, as well as the defense of immigrants, the defense of Black communities against police brutality, trying to root ourselves in local struggles while always having a global perspective. Our analysis is that American exceptionalism is really the number one obstacle to class consciousness in the United States, along with white supremacy. That so long as the U.S. working class views itself as part of a privileged position over the rest of the world, that the U.S. form of government is a superior one, that the U.S. has the right and the ability to lecture the world about democracy and human rights, and so long as it sees itself this way, it cannot really make a full break with its own ruling class. And we also see that imperialism is the number one way in which the U.S. ruling class forms itself. That while they may disagree on many other issues of domestic politics, on foreign politics, there's a high degree of unity between both parties and the different foreign policy think tanks and institutions. And this is how the ruling class really forms itself as a class and speaks as a class, is on the issue of imperialism. So unless we go straight at the heart of their point of unity, we can't really break workers away from bourgeois ideology and bourgeois politics. So for the last 18 years, while we've been organizing in our communities, we've also been responding to the different foreign policy crises that U.S. imperialism in particular has provoked. So as I said, in the Iraq War, there were mass demonstrations, hundreds of thousands of people into the streets, in Germany as well. And, you know, the New York Times even called the anti-war movement the second global superpower at one point. The US was the first and the anti-war movement was the second. That was a bit exaggerated, but it indicated this new international movement that was developing. But we have to be honest, which is that in the years that followed, a series of international crises emerged, which created huge international confusion among the left. Despite the defeat of US imperialism in Iraq and in Afghanistan at the hands of really an indigenous resistance in both countries, and despite the global financial crisis of 2008 and 2009, which showed that the US was not the invincible power that it projected. In the ideological realm, in the realm of ideas and politics, people still viewed the United States, the US media, the US ideological centers as the referees, as the arbitrators of who represented democracy and who represents dictatorship, who represents human rights, and who represents the violators of human rights. And so, for instance, when the Libya conflict began in 2011, which had the additional complication of emerging next to the Arab Spring, although being, we would say, a different phenomenon, actually, the US used this opportunity to reinsert itself militarily, politically, and ideologically, that it was somehow the standard bearer for morality and human rights. And our organization organized very hard, just as we had against the Iraq War, against the Libya War. But instead of hundreds of thousands of people coming out, we had at most 200 people. We showed the same amount of energy, the same amount of, we poured ourselves, we worked day and night, we put up the same amount of posters, we made the same amount of phone calls, and people didn't show up. And then the Syria war, which was in a way a replay of Libya, but had additional ideological problems, which I won't get into. But the point is that in a way, the US, we can see these conflicts together, Iraq, Libya, and Syria, but because there wasn't a common understanding of imperialism, the anti-war movement was incapable of rising to the challenge. Of course, the Syria war also presented a new moment in world politics because of the Russian intervention. And I think we have to recognize that were it not for the Russian intervention, it is quite likely that the Syrian government would have been overthrown. Without the support of Russia, Syria too would have been knocked over, just as Iraq and Libya were. And this would have been quite a catastrophic development for the Middle East, were the Syrian government to be overthrown. So I think in our current moment, as we think about how we're looking at the Ukraine war and a more assertive Russia on global politics, we should start with, of course, the civil war in Ukraine, but also the intervention in Syria as the beginning of a new stage where the unipolar era has come to a close. So I'll stop there as an introduction about our party and our sort of overall worldview.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was a very good introduction in the case that we already stopped at the point that we wanted to start with our questions towards you. So in our current debate that we also have here on our Kommunismus Kongress, there are different positions on whether there are countries within an imperialist system where these are. And you mentioned it now with Russia, and some do also with China. Are we really seeing the point that we're breaking into a multipolar world, as to opposed to the former times of US hegemony and unipolar imperialism, which you also mentioned quite a lot in the book that we've read, very interested in it, which you also wrote articles in for. So is that still the case? Are we still living in that unipolar world, with the US being in the top position, followed by there are other dependent on them, smaller imperialists like Germany, France, or Great Britain, or as the decline of the US hegemony began? And are we living in a multipolar world already, with the US being one power among others? That's maybe
in a way. I would like to say yes to all of them, because I don't think they're exactly either or questions. That it has to be one or the other. Because from the standpoint of the United States government, the ruling class, it has not accepted a multipolar world. It is operating and organizing as if it still controlled the world in the same way as it did 20 years ago. And it still desires to restore that world to the extent there are deviations from it, they are seen as deviations. See, when they talk about the international rules-based order, that's the world they're talking about. And so they still operate from the standpoint that every deviation from that, every violation of that rule, of those rules, have to be punished, and that they have the right to punish them unilaterally. When you look at what the US is doing to Venezuela, what it's doing to Cuba, in fact, it's unilateral coercive measures, which is the term that the Venezuelan government uses. It's a very complicated term for just a blockade. The blockade is actually more comprehensive than it was even in the unipolar era, because now they are using the tools of financial imperialism, of insurance imperialism, if we want to call it that. You know that the ships that want to carry oil from Iran to Cuba, or from Venezuela to Cuba, the shipping companies can't process the transactions to be able to take the oil, even though they're willing to. They can't find a bank that would be willing to process their transaction. Or if they find a bank, then they can't find an insurance company that will insure the boat, or that will insure the captain of the ship's license for them to violate a US law. This is trade between two sovereign countries, Iran and Cuba. And yet US law, having put Cuba and Iran on the state sponsors of terrorism list, is somehow international law. So we can't delude ourselves into thinking that this global financial system, which ultimately is the fabric of the global capitalist system, is somehow now multipolar or polycentric. It absolutely is a unilateral, unipolar world. In that sense. In the military sense too, I would say, in general, all the other junior partners of imperialism are completely reliant on the US military. And we can look at US military spending, also the production of armaments, that the US can cripple many militaries like that, the same way they can financially, because they can just simply stop delivering certain parts to countries that they've sold weapon systems to. At the same time, it is definitely true that the US cannot dictate to the world in the same way that it could before. China and Russia have risen within the international rules-based order. Now, this is also a contradiction that I think we have to identify. They are not simply building, China has not really built a separate world economy. It is not like the Soviet Union or the socialist bloc that it's building a separate set of treaties and political systems and economic systems. China has risen within the US unipolar world order. It has not built a substitute for it. Russia has risen within it to an extent, but Russia's economy is smaller than Texas. Russia's GDP is smaller than Texas. Russia has a GDP per capita of $12,000. That's, I think, the same as Costa Rica per capita, the same as Panama. You know, the US and many of the historically first world countries have GDP per capita of around $60,000. So Russia was converted into a gas station for the West. It does not have the financial, technological, it does have a military might as an inheritance of the Soviet Union. But we shouldn't, I think the danger of saying we're already in a multipolar world suggests there's some sort of equilibrium that exists, that there's some sort of equality that exists. And in fact, what we're finding is that simply the countries that were not integrated into the leadership of the G7, that were not integrated into the leadership of the imperialist world order under US control, are now, have risen within that rules-based system and are now demanding a greater place at the table. But merely to put them at the table would destabilize that unipolar world system. Let me give you an example so that it's not so abstract. In the early 90s, many asked, why not integrate Russia into NATO? It's a capitalist country. Many in the German high command actually wanted this. Not many, but some in the German high command wanted it. They had an affinity towards Russia. Russia's a capitalist country. Russia basically was doing at that period whatever the US told it to do. Why not bring Russia into NATO? From a theoretical standpoint, it should be possible since it's an alliance of capitalist states. But of course, to bring Russia into NATO would have created a gravitational pull, a natural center of gravity between Germany and Russia. And the US would no longer have absolute control over NATO. Even if at that moment it had absolute control, when the US foreign policy establishment thinks 30 or 40 years down the road, when it makes its projections of Russia back on its feet, accepted into the international capitalist world system as it existed then, would become a rival center to the United States once again on a capitalist basis. So they knew they had to actually keep Russia out of NATO, not just to weaken Russia, but to weaken Germany. They wanted to ensure that Germany would not become that rival power also. This was called the Wolfowitz Doctrine in the early 1990s. And the main tenet, the main principle of that doctrine was to ensure that in a new American century, that no other capitalist power would rise to challenge the United States. So it's for this reason that Russia had to be sort of kicked out of the club. It had to be kicked out of the G8. It couldn't be allowed into NATO. And it's not that Russia wanted to be in the imperialist club. I don't mean to make Russia out to some, it wanted entrance into it. All it wanted to be was respected within it. So anyway, I think these are some of the contradictions that the US is fighting for it. But now the countries like Russia and China, I think, are coming to the conclusion that they'll never really get an equal place at the table in terms of the world system. And so now they're openly calling for a multipolar world. And that is very attractive for the countries of the global south, regardless of their ideological persuasion, because similar to the Cold War period, having multiple power centers that are in contradiction with each other creates openings, creates space for countries to pursue alternative models of development. And then you're able in the global south to play them against each other. So in a way, I would say that that's a very long answer. I'm sorry. But in short, we're moving towards a multipolar world. We're not there yet. And in fact, I would say we're in a very dangerous moment, because when you think about when each time the world system has changed, when it went from a multipolar world created World War I. That was a multipolar world. A multipolar world created World War II. That was a multipolar world. It was only after World War II, the unipolar era, was the capitalists recognizing the thesis of Lenin, which is that Lenin said capitalism leads to wars. Imperialism will lead to wars. And the capitalists recognize if we do not create a system where we're able to manage our conflict, manage our rivalry, we will ultimately go to war every 20 years, and there will be socialist revolutions all over the place. So we have to find a new way of accommodating one another. So at each moment that the world system has changed, it's meant massive wars. It doesn't change peacefully traditionally. So as we're moving from this unipolar to multipolar world, the great danger is that the United States is willing to go to potentially catastrophic world war to prevent that from happening.
You also already mentioned the different interests of different imperialist countries, like in our case, Germany, in the regards to the relation to Russia. Which role do you think the transatlantic partners of the US have in comparison to the US? And how does this relationship between them develop currently? And where do you see maybe future splitting points also?
Well, I think this is why the United States ruling class is very happy about the Ukraine war. I think we have to understand that while they will cry and whine about it because it allows them to score certain political points, they're very happy about the Ukraine war. On one hand, it's achieved the purpose of, they think, bleeding Russia, similar to how the Russia's Afghanistan war did, or the Soviet Union. They see this as an opportunity to tie down Russia for a lengthy period of time. But two, it allows them to achieve to discipline and subordinate the European powers. I believe that there was great anxiety developing the last few years about a more assertive Germany, a more assertive France, not so much Britain. Britain is always kind of in the pocket of the United States. But when you look at the conflicts in Africa, in Libya, in Mali, elsewhere, a more assertive French imperialism using its former colonies to reassert itself on the international stage. This was something that caused concern. The fact that the negotiations over the Syrian civil war were being held in Turkey, were being held in Russia, were not being held, what the US did not step in as its mediated process was unable to solve the situation in Syria. This also caused concern. And of course, Ukraine, the Minsk agreements taking place without the US as a signatory. These were all causes of concern, because these, from the standpoint of the unipolar world order, the United States always has to be brought in to give its approval to any international political crisis. This is the real rule of the international rules-based order. So I think that, you can tell me better than I can tell you, but it seemed from here that there was a growing anti-NATO sentiment over the last 20 years in Europe, that at least the left parties were able to articulate this, that the notion of going to war with Russia was seen as, absolute insanity that no one wanted. And it appears now that from the standpoint of reconsolidating NATO, this war has been excellent for US imperialism. We try to keep tabs on the parties and organizations of the European left to the extent we can. And we saw some of the parties that had been leading anti-NATO demonstrations, who have anti-NATO sentiments in their preambles of their constitutions, saying things like, this is not the time to criticize NATO, or this is not the time to talk about military spending, or this is not the time to talk about breaking with the US. Even parties of the left supporting weapons shipments to Ukraine, which was the original sin of 1914, if we remember. So I think from that standpoint, the tendency towards inter-imperialist conflict between the US and its junior partners, it still exists. It can't go away because it's rooted in political economy. And the ruling classes are distinct of the different countries. We don't believe that there's a single unitary transnational capitalist class that rules everything. There are distinct ruling classes. But because of the military might of the United States, the financial might of the United States, the fact, for instance, that the US could tear up the Iran nuclear deal, which France, Germany, 7 other powers had signed on to, the US walks away, and then basically all the other imperialist countries, they complain about it, but they basically tear it up too, and they refuse to do business with Iran. They shoot themselves in the foot. They could have made billions in Iran, but to keep Donald Trump happy and to keep US banks happy, they refused to resist. So that was just the beginning. Now, of course, it's Nord Stream 2. Now it's all these other things. But so the European ruling classes, it appears from here at least, do not have the fortitude or strength to really stand up to the US. In fact, while they complain about the style of the United States, when push comes to shove, it means, when it really matters, they always retain their subservient role. I don't think that can last forever, but it feels right now with the Ukraine war that it's quite solid. It's quite consolidated, this junior relationship.
So maybe since we're already quite forward in time, before we go into a more open questions round, I would like you to talk a bit more about how the PSL differentiates between imperialist and non-imperialist actors or states, and maybe also since we already talked about countries that are rising within the world system, which categories or which criteria do you use when saying a country is imperialist? You, for example, write that you can't use Lenin's 5 principles as laying them down and checking if that applies to a country, and that not only capital export or the access to markets is our criteria. So maybe you could talk a bit more about the PSL's understanding of that question.
And I know we get all very sensitive when we say that something about Lenin might need to be updated. But while we believe that Lenin's core theses are correct about how he identifies imperialism, but we have to really first understand the book Lenin's Imperialism. What was he trying to do with that book? He was trying to uncover what was the underlying political economy that led to the World War. He was trying to go back and understand what made this conflict irrepressible. Because remember, people had been saying for decades that a war was coming, and that they didn't want it, and yet it happened. So what made it happen? And he was trying to understand, of course, the social roots of opportunism in the workers' movement. But he was not starting from an academic exercise of trying to categorize states. He was trying to understand the war as it was unraveling, and try to understand its underlying dynamics. So that's why when we go back to this book, we should say, let's adopt Lenin's methodology. It's not so much about his definitions, pure and simple, because if Lenin were looking at the world in 2022, if he were looking at the ways in which military spending has grown so much, if he were looking not at just the history of colonialism, but at the history of how the US built these new treaty organizations like NATO, how it built trade organizations, how the whole history of socialism, the whole history of capitalism since. In other words, we have to adopt his methodology and bring it forward and look at the last century the way that he looked at the century of the 19th century. That's how we should look at the 20th century to understand imperialism today. So when he was looking at his 5 points to define imperialism, he was trying to use 5 points to define the global system, not to define individual countries. When the world has been divided, when the colonial division of the world is already complete, right? He wasn't saying which countries have had a colony. He was describing the world. So, for instance, if we look at which countries export capital, I mean, you can find many, many countries that export capital now, even in the global south. All the oil producing, Qatar and Oman probably export more capital than they import. But it doesn't mean that they are imperialist countries. And those things can actually fluctuate in today's financial system, the flows of capital, for instance. So what we try to do is actually look at and we also want to bring in the military reality, I think, in a way that did not exist in Lenin's time. The idea that one country, the United States, would have 1,000 military bases in 81 countries requires us to define imperialism a little differently, because we have to look at who is basically the police force for the international financial and trade system. And that is the US Navy, the US Air Force, the US military. So we've been trying to define our global system as we've been doing here today, a unipolar imperialist world order that is now transitioning to a multipolar order, and trying to figure out what role do each state play within that order. So derive the categories from the actual practice, derive the categories from the actual experience and the actual history. Don't derive the categories first and then go try to find the countries. Does that make sense? I don't know if that's coming through. But so for instance, right now, we don't want to exclude the possibility that at one day Russia could be atop or really rivaling the United States. It's theoretically possible, right? But the main conflicts that Russia's having right now are not about the acquisition of markets. It's not about the export of capital. It's not. The Ukraine war is not economically beneficial to Russia, to say the least. It's a catastrophe for Russia. And even if they, and winning the war for Russia, even if they were to somehow come to some peace, it doesn't leave them in an economically much stronger position than before. If they wanted to trade and access Ukrainian raw materials and so forth, they didn't need to go to war to do that. They have corrupt oligarchs they could have traded with if they needed to. They know how to do that. So this is really a question of geopolitics and of Russia's red lines from the standpoint of whether it would be militarily encircled for the next 100 years. For Russia, they see the presence of NATO and Western, basically bringing Ukraine into the Western sphere of influence as like a checkmate, that Russia's checkmated for the next 100 years. I'm talking about, this is the viewpoint of the Russian ruling class. That doesn't mean that they see this as a defensive war. They actually do. That doesn't mean we have to agree with them. Doesn't mean we have to say that's justified in every sense, but we have to at least understand that they really do see this as a defensive war. And the Syria intervention likewise, because this was the one place in the Mediterranean where the Russian military still had access to a port. And they saw this as an opportunity to to basically, cut Russia off from the Middle East. If Syria falls, Russia's cut off from the Middle East. And that too would have been a checkmate. So I think that, and China, I mean, it's clear that they've been rising and they are going to continue to rise. But China has no record of going to war with other countries, of seeking colonies in the same way. I think China is different from Russia, that China still fundamentally rests on the social conquest of the Chinese Revolution, despite all the capitalist reforms and the introduction of capitalist ideology. I actually would categorize China simply because its state rests on a different basis than Russia. Its state flows from the Chinese Revolution, and its current policy actually comes from an internal political struggle within a communist party that's made a revolution. Whereas Putin and the Russian ruling class is the group that overturned socialism. So we can't put them two in the same category either. We think that while the BRICS phenomenon, these other rising states, is an important one, and in a way it's a welcome one, they don't have any internal consistency between them other than the fact that they're trying to rise within the existing world system, that they don't have any natural ideological unity between them, that they won't necessarily be of any assistance to socialist projects. They could easily turn on one another, and they will always be looking for favor with the West. So India will search for favor from the West, China, Russia. So this is a very unstable alliance. We don't think it amounts to like a counterbalance or an alternative sort of center to the US. They're really countries that have shared grievances about having billions and billions of people and yet having no vote at the UN Security Council, or having no place at the G7, or having to follow US sanctions and things like that. So I'm sorry that got a little long-winded, but in short, we try to understand the geopolitics and figure out what role are the different countries playing within it. And so in that sense, we would say Russia is not an imperialist power, because it's not playing the role of a leading force in the current imperialist world order. It's the size of Texas, and from its standpoint, it's trying to defend itself from the US imperialist world order, which is doing everything it can to plan out the next 70 or 80 years in which Russia is in a permanently subordinated position. So we can't start from the categories, start with definitions, and ignore what's driving the political and military situation around us, which ultimately was Lenin's methodology.
Thanks a lot. I think, Thanks a lot for these very interesting answers. I think there's also a lot to discuss. I would like to bring in one final question before we open up for everyone, and that's a bit more the focus on the situation in the US itself for the US working class. You already said that in your introduction, that basically as long as white supremacy is the persistent ideology, the US working class cannot break with its own ruling class. And I would like to know, so how exactly is this ideological influence, but also the economic influence on the US working class being the working class in the world hegemon state? So maybe you can say a few more words about that, and also maybe about the class struggles going on in the US at the moment.
Yeah, thank you for that. There are 140 million people in the United States who are either in poverty or are near poverty. So the poverty rate for an individual is like $14,000 per year if you're living by yourself. $14,000, which is an incredibly low poverty rate, an artificial poverty rate. The rent here in New York is in many places $1,500 a month for a studio apartment, meaning an apartment without a separate bedroom. So if you're living by yourself, and you can do the math, 1,500 times 12, that's $18,000. So if poverty rate is $14,000 and you could spend $18,000 just on rent, obviously the poverty rate is ridiculously low. So we say we have to recalculate the poverty rate here. Instead of 14,000, it should, at the minimum, it should be double that. Let's say 28,000. So when you double the poverty rate, when you double the poverty number, then the number of people who fall under these categories then is 140 million people. This is nearly half of the country. And we're talking about a majority of Black and Latino people, but even a significant minority of white people who fall under this 140 million. And we think that this economic reality creates a basis for class unity, because it means whether you're white, Black, or Latino, if you can't pay the rent, you have a common interest against your landlord. You have a common interest in higher wages. You have a common interest in publicly funded healthcare, and so on and so on. These are all elementary principles for us. But the main problem of US politics is that the working class doesn't have its own party on a mass scale. We have a political system which is highly controlled. It's very difficult to break into from the standpoint of electoral politics. If we had a parliamentary system in the United States, there would undoubtedly be socialists, and I would say even communists in the parliament right now. So I don't think people should confuse the control of the Democrats and Republicans in the political realm to mean that everyone supports that, or that there aren't major left-wing currents. It's the problem is, without a party and without an opportunity to intervene, the fact that you need 51% of every district in order to get into Congress, for instance, makes it very difficult for the left to create its own electoral forms and to run. But if we were talking about purely, if you could vote on what you actually supported, and the socialists therefore would be free to run as socialists and would not have to, many of them support the Democrats because they feel this is the least bad option, the socialists would certainly get 10, 12, 15% right away. And I think from there would continue to grow, because from having the platform of being in Congress, as we see with someone like AOC or Bernie Sanders, who are not even that radical, they're able to really agitate and grow their audiences. So in a way, I'm hopeful, because there's a growth in interest in socialism. It's up to 40 to 50% of young people now have a positive impression of socialism in the United States, even though it's about 1% of Congress, or in a way you could say 0% if you wanted to be correct. But this means that the radicalism that's developing, the interest in socialism that's developing, is mostly going to find its expression in non-electoral roots, in street protests, in social movements. And 2 years ago, there were 35 million people who joined a protest after the murder of George Floyd. This was the largest amount of protesters in US history. And what was significant is that there were many young white people, young Asian people who were joining these protests. It wasn't just Black and Latino people. It was also in very small towns that had almost never seen an anti-racist protest ever, talking about the issue of police brutality. So our party was very centrally involved in those protests and has grown a lot as a result. Many young people who enter the struggle, whatever they enter the struggle for, whatever injustice is burning them and agitating them, it's in the actual practice of fighting back and seeing what side the police are on, and seeing what side the media is on, and seeing what side all the political leaders are on, that people begin to develop radical ideas and search for radical solutions. We can't forget that the Democratic mayors, almost all the major cities are run by Democrats in the United States. They all imposed curfews during those protests. They actually bowed to Trump, even while condemning him. They basically tried to eliminate the movement, and the protests continued, and they defied the curfews, and it was a very heroic moment for the U.S. Right now, the challenge we have is that with a Democratic administration, we have a complex of NGOs in the United States, as well as, I would say, a big part of the labor movement, which believes that it's not appropriate to protest against a Democratic administration because all you do is help the Republicans. And so we've seen this under Obama, and now we're seeing it under Biden, where, in fact, a lot of the protest energy goes down for a period. Under Obama, it took the Occupy Wall Street movement 3 years later to kind of come out, and then the Black Lives Matter movement towards the end of his administration. But there's always this pressure to not condemn the Democrats too strongly. And so we're kind of in one of those moments again in the United States where things are kind of calm, but beneath the calm, there's a big energy of frustration, of anger towards both parties. Maybe I can't talk about it here, but we do think the 2024 elections is going to cause another major political crisis. It's likely to be create another constitutional crisis, actually, which is almost unprecedented in U.S. history. That January 6th, the attempt at sort of a fascist insurrection in the United States, will be a dress rehearsal for what is to come, because the right-wing judges are already laying the groundwork for potentially stealing the next election and ignoring the popular vote. Anyway, this is a big, complicated issue that requires understanding some of the U.S. legal cases. But the point being that even though things look calm, there's deep crisis at the heart of the U.S. political system that is going to erupt, we think, very soon.
So since we're already quite forward in our time schedule, we would like to start now with the open questions round.
Great.
So first of all, I would like to say that in my view, you pose a very firm analysis of our system today. And following that, I have some questions regarding Russia specifically. So you talked about the political economy needed to be present, for example, in the US. So they have this imperialist standpoint. Do you think this political economy, at least the basis, is also present in Russia? That's my question. Yeah, and do you think the conflict right now? Do you think it's also caused by the tendency of, if you think the political economy is present in Russia, do you think the current conflict is also partly caused by it because they are forced because of this not to give up their sphere of influence? That's my first question, and I will just do a second one. You talked about electoralism, getting into Senate, getting into Parliament. I know the system in the US is very difficult, but I wanted to know, do you think of electoralism only because it can be used as a platform to propagate socialism, or do you also see a chance in electoralism itself? Because that's a question that's very discussed here in Germany, and I would like how you interpret what you said.
The political economy of Russia is largely, or is decisively capitalist. It's pursuing profits and resources. It does have this other memory. The sort of ruling class has other memory of state management, and it would be very interesting as Russia gets closed off from international trade, to the extent they'll need to renationalize some things. I think that's quite possible, actually, in the coming future for Russia. But the point about it, whether it theoretically could develop into imperialism, sure, but I don't think it has any practical ability to become a leader of the current global system. That unless that would lead to like a major world war if it were to try to do this, and it can't substitute or even play a role within. It can't substitute for the United States, and it can't play a role within the U.S. Sort of military and financial system, as I sort of outlined before. I don't think Ukraine is really about a sphere of influence in sort of a pre-World War I period, but I think for the Russian ruling class, it sees basically having the space that it had with the Soviet Union as necessary for its own national defense and for its own national rise. And it is actually, Putin is reviving actually czarist notions and ideological notions. And we shouldn't, I don't mean to belittle that at all. His attack on Bolshevism and on Lenin and on the nationalities policy is very important because he's really slandering the history of communism. So in a way it is a sphere of influence, but I don't think that the imperialist world today operates on sphere of influences in the traditional way. So even that doesn't necessarily mean that it should be equated to the actual imperialist powers. Electoralism is only to propagate socialism, I have to say. And also, hopefully we can improve the lives of people at the same time by creating coalitions and movements that pressure, for reforms under capitalism, of course. But ultimately, it's not a road to socialism, which requires absolutely smashing the state, the capitalist state, that is. So we wish we could have some voice in electoralism because we think we'd be very effective agitators against capitalism. But that's the only reason why we really want to be there. We want to crash the party, as we would say. And
first of all, thank you for giving us the opportunity to speak with you. I would like to have your opinion on the planned military spending by the German state. For context, Germany is going to spend 1 billion euros in military budget. They justify this with that we need to defend ourselves from a possible Russian attack. And what we truly see in that action is that the German ruling class is in the process of trying to become independent of the USA in terms of being able to invade other countries independently. Do you think the German ruling class will be able to become free of the military dependency of the US, also considering that the US imperialism is becoming weaker? Thank you.
I'm an expert on this, and I would defer to you all more, I think. My sense is that there are different factions of the German ruling class who have their own motivations with respect to increasing the military spending. I think we're still a very long way away from being independent of the United States. Even spending by itself insofar as it relies on U.S. military hardware and high technology, and we should recognize that all the new advanced weapon systems to really compete in the multiple domains of modern warfare rely on very high technology, and you can spend a lot of money and still be totally dependent on U.S. weapon systems, for instance. But it just strikes me from the standpoint of politics that there's not a break coming in the near future. The Iran nuclear deal, the Minsk agreements, many other things, I think, point to the subservience over the next, I would say, for the foreseeable future of the European ruling classes. Of course, there's that historical memory that the German ruling class has, the French ruling class has, the Italian ruling class has of their previous greatness, and that will never go away. And there will always be elements that want to revive it. But I would actually think that a figure like Trump, who was calling on the European countries to spend more on NATO, who is for withdrawing U.S. presence in Europe in a way, a figure like him would be necessary in the United States to create an opening for the German and French bourgeoisies to take those next steps. Biden and the real center of the foreign policy establishment in the United States have an Atlantic orientation. And I think that they have it's a top priority for them to make sure that that does not happen. And I don't see open defiance of someone like Biden coming from the German ruling class.
Okay. Hi, Ben. Thank you so much for your talk. I think you made some very valid points. I wanted to get into the question of white supremacy again, because I found it really interesting that your party is also called a party of liberation and not only socialism. For a bit of context, I feel like in Europe, or at least in Germany, communists usually don't really use the words white supremacy, also patriarchy maybe as an analogy, because it implies some way of rule. And people usually say that there's a main struggle, which is against the bourgeoisie, because the first line of oppression is capitalism. You're first oppressed as a worker, because that's the regimen. And then maybe as a side struggle or as a second line of oppression, there's things such as racism or sexism to divide the working class. But basically, people like to say the economic struggle is the struggle that we should focus on, meaning worker strikes, for example, and not movements like, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement. They usually talk about this and say that it's a kind of identity politics that's quite liberal and not really useful to the socialist struggle. How would you respond to those people?
Yes. Excellent point. This is the main ideological terrain, in a way, in which we are fighting here in the United States. Because identity politics, which maybe is a term I think that can be sometimes it can lead to confusion and problems. Because the idea that identity can substitute for class, that it is a real thing. And it's being promoted in the bourgeois universities that you don't need a class analysis. You don't need a Marxist method. You need to just start from the standpoint of one's personal experience and one's personal identity. And this can trump everything else. But in a way, we've started to call this like identity determinism. You know how Marxism used to be called economic determinism. Because not every expression of identity is therefore identity politics. And I think this is the error that many Marxists make, is that they see any expression against racism or the organization based on identity as inherently anti-communist or anti-working class. And I think the whole history of the United States actually points in the opposite direction. It was the struggle of Black people against slavery, the enslaved, that was the engine that brought the whole country into struggle. It was the civil rights movement that gave such new life to a radical communist working class trend, that brought new life to the workers' movement, even at the rank and file level, that stimulated and merged with the anti-war movements. And so, in fact, the movements for liberation, for national liberation, for sexual liberation, are very important for the formation of class unity. And instead of accepting that these two things are opposed, we should find ways in which they are interrelated. And we should distinguish between the justified rebellions against racism, the sort of spontaneous development of Black organizations, distinguish between that from below and what is really a carefully constructed ideological scheme from the bourgeoisie, which is to atomize the working class. And that requires ultimately the development of Marxist and communist leaders from the oppressed. Because it's going to be very hard for a white Marxist to go into the Black Lives Matter movement and say, hey guys, this is, leading us in the wrong direction. And that your struggle is secondary. As if being beaten up by the police is secondary to a wage cut. I mean, that's ridiculous. Just think about it. It's ridiculous. Or the idea of being a victim of domestic abuse as a woman in your home, that this is secondary to the abuse that you suffer on the job. This is absurd. And so the question is how to interrelate these things, how to use the struggles against any form of injustice to show how do we win. And it's when you pose the question of how do you win that you must land at class politics, that the Black Lives Matter movement, in fact, needed the working class as a whole to rally to its defense because the movement could not defeat the state by itself. It needed support and a united struggle from many others. And who is going to be the best ambassador and the messenger for that statement is going to have Black communists and women communists who are in those movements organically, developing leadership, and also making the point that we should be finding allies. We should be looking for solidarity with other struggles. We should fight any attempt to atomize our struggles from the media and from others. And so that requires a party in particular to play the role of the ideological, the recruitment and training of people from oppressed backgrounds. The most oppressed backgrounds have to be given priority in terms of training them as the leaders, because they actually are going to have a key role in uniting the class. We shouldn't pretend that the class is already united and that the Black Lives Matter movement is dividing it. The class is divided. So wherever there's struggles within our already divided class, the question is how do we use those struggles to build unity?
Yeah, thank you for the talk. I'm Stefan of the Platypus Affiliated Society. I would like to go back to a point you made about the beginning of the PSL and also a point you made about Lenin. So you said, and I agree, that Lenin's imperialism is not just about like formulae, like is a country imperialist because it exports more capital than it imports, for example, but also the book was an intervention into a split of the Marxist movement and the parties of that time, right? And so when I think about where your organization comes from, you said there was the necessity for an independent workers' party in the US, and you saw that within the anti-Iraq war movement. And I can't really square one thing, right? Like you said, the major obstacle against class consciousness in the US right now was white supremacy, more or less like the self-avowed right. But what about a thing like the DSA, like the Democratic Socialists of America? And a lot of leftist groups like liquidated, just dissolved themselves into the DSA. And the DSA, if we call it out polemically, was the water carrier for Bernie Sanders, who tried to run as the candidate for the party that bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki and started the war with Vietnam and supported the war on Iraq and Afghanistan. So wasn't there also an obstacle on the left for people, instead of coming to you, joining your party for an independent working class, thinking like, if I'm for socialism, I should somehow support the Democrats? Because when I hear you, and this might be a misunderstanding, I still can't shake off the feeling that you say, look, they're both right-wing parties of the capital, but still we somehow should support the Democrats. But this contradicts itself with what you also said before, right? It's that especially Black Lives Matter, for example, helped to reintegrate and defend the Democratic Party and, like be propaganda more or less in the electoral struggle against the Republicans. So you, as an experienced millennial cadre, what do you think should we learn from that?
A series of complex questions. But I will say in short, there's a danger of purity politics where we see a new development in politics and we say, is it chemically pure? Does it have all the prerequisites for communist intervention? When in fact, all the different naturally arising spaces of resistance are going to be heavily infected by bourgeois ideology of one form or another, precisely because the left was basically liquidated in the United States. So it's impossible, if we understand that and appreciate that historically, that a movement, as people come into struggle or becoming interested in socialist ideas, that they will come in with our viewpoint. They will make use of whatever ideas are circulating at the time, in their moment. So Black Lives Matter is I would say, a very contested space. There are absolutely bourgeois forces who have basically used it as an electoral machine, but not very successfully. Young black voter turnout is extremely low, precisely because that program, that political project of just basically supporting the Democrats, doesn't resonate with the people who are fighting against police officers in cities that were controlled by the Democrats. So the only way that we can make those points, though, is by being with them, side by side, shoulder to shoulder. The DSA has its own complex history, the Democratic Socialists, but in short, I would say it's less of a project directed by a political program, so much as it's a space. It's like an open space that anyone can join very easily. The leadership has shifted many times in the last 10 years, last 5 years even. It's unclear to identify who's the leader of it in this city or that city. I think many parties made mistakes by liquidating themselves, for sure. Our party ran independent presidential candidates just to put your conscience, put you at ease a little bit. We ran against the Democrats every time. So we run independent third-party presidential tickets in each case. But I would say this: we actually critically supported Bernie Sanders running for. We didn't want him to run as a Democrat, but we critically supported his campaign in the sense that we believed it would have been useful for him to stay in the race longer. It would have been better had he defeated the right-wing candidates. And we believe that the people who are coming around his campaign were coming around not because they supported the bombing of Hiroshima, but because they wanted public health care and they were for Black Lives Matter and they were, afraid of climate change. So in that sense, it also became a space in which we intervened. And we intervened with a flyer that said, if Bernie really cared about these issues, he should actually run as a third party. He should break with the Democrats because they're going to sabotage his campaign. They're going to destroy his campaign. And we actually say, run as a third party, Bernie, then we'll really support you. And through that kind of tactical intervention, there were some Bernie supporters who said, yeah, I'm more of a Bernie supporter than Bernie himself. Bernie sold us out. And then those people who said they felt sold out, some of them moved into the PSL. So that's the whole point of having sort of tactical flexibility.
I have a question concerning the role of US imperialism. So I think we agree that the USA is still the strongest imperialist power in the world, with also distinct qualities that other countries do not have with other options to rule. But on the same time, I think that we see a tendency that countries still do align with the US in a military sense, in military unions and clubs. And on the other hand, we also see a tendency that more and more countries tend to align on an economic level, not with the US anymore, but they tend to align actually with China. And I think it's very important to see that there is kind of an underlying hidden dynamics here that we do not recognize because it's not actually easily to see. For example, China is actively establishing new norms, new industry norms along the Belt and Road Initiative, for example. We can see that in the financial system, actually fueled by the Ukrainian war, there is a tendency to do the deals in other currencies that in US dollar. We know that in the Iraq war, US stopped this tendency by stopping dealing oil in euro, right? So, but this is coming in, and I wondered whether you can elaborate on this. My question is, isn't there a weakening of these global financial instruments that the US still has? I mean, they're still there, of course. Your examples were very clear, but they tend to be weakened, actually, and we should also recognize this.
I totally agree. In the sense that this is why I say we're in a transition moment, and how far along in the process is somewhat, it's impossible to say. And when sort of these quantitative differences of a weakening, because that's what a weakening means, right? A slight diminution. When it becomes a qualitative difference and it becomes, really a multipolar reality, I don't think any of us can quite anticipate. But I do think there's a danger in feeling that we're already there. And I think that the process of decoupling, for instance, which the US financial newspapers are talking about, the US was the most interconnected with China, of all these countries. And the US capital class is making fortunes there. And they've basically been told to get out. And they don't want to get out, and they're trying to drag their feet. But it's an example of the US military and political considerations being in command. Mao famously said politics should be in command over economics. And I think the Pentagon has listened to him because they are putting politics in command quite a bit. So I think these dynamics you're talking about are real. Belt and Road, the industry norms, the currency standards, but these are all just growing. And whether they will develop into true rivals I think remains to be seen.
Thank you for your talk. It was really refreshing and interesting. I have a question concerning equidistance, I would say. We have here in Germany, we experience this controversy, and even within our ranks, on the topic of whether to condemn the invasion of Russia or to defend it as a defensive act. And I found it really interesting how you put it, that you said, first of all, it's the Russian ruling class which sees it as a defensive act, and there's not so much that we can say about it. It's like whether we like it or not, it has this characteristics, but it still remains the question: what does it mean in our relationship? Because I don't think we can somehow abstain. We don't can say we see it. We see the defensive nature of it, and at the same time say, yeah, but it has to be condemned. It's I think really tricky to navigate this, and I would be interested in how you would.
We also spent quite a bit of time trying to figure out the right formulation for how to boil that down into something simple. I totally understand what you're saying. The formulation we used on February 24th is that while we do not support the invasion of Ukraine, we refuse to condemn it. because to condemn it would be to essentially eliminate the prehistory, what led to it, and would suggest, and we won't hear any condemnations from someone who won't also condemn NATO, who won't also condemn the role of bringing Russia to the brink, for sabotaging the Minsk agreements, or refusing to dialogue around peace. I mean, even to this day, the US could bring this war to an end very quickly. We already know that Russia and Ukraine, in the dialogue that were moderated by Erdogan, they could have had peace many months ago. They could, and it's the U.S. that we believe that Putin is actually telling the truth on this one. That they told Zelensky to not sign a deal. So if we just make this about Russia, Ukraine, what is your view on that? And you abstract out the rest of the world, then you've basically you've basically distorted reality. And so for us, we're not saying we support our party, I would say, is historically closer to those who are actually supporting Russia right now in the global South, especially. But we haven't adopted slogans of like victory to Russia or victory to the anti-fascist front or anything like that. Nor do we say Russia out of Ukraine, because to say Russia out of Ukraine right now would be basically victory for NATO. Because what about NATO out of Ukraine? What about the Western military stop encroaching on Russia? So we've confined our slogans to basically anti-NATO slogans at this moment, and we've condemned the U.S. for provoking the war. We've done all that without saying we support the invasion. Personally, I think that Putin fell into a trap. I think Putin miscalculated. I think that from a military standpoint, from a strategic standpoint, that will be borne out. But that's sort of a side issue. The main thing is to condemn the role of NATO. I think that's our chief responsibility in the West.
Yesterday, we heard from comrades from Russia that are claiming a concept of fascism in foreign policy by NATO and especially the USA. And I would like to hear your opinion on this and on the thesis that the US is already like fascist state because of the hard and aggressive right-wing policies.
The U.S. has always had fascistic tendencies within it. I think that we don't use the word fascist here to describe the U.S. state because it immediately leads to analogies and comparisons with Germany under Hitler or Italy under Mussolini, and this is not that useful for people to understand the U.S. political system. However, Hitler learned from the U.S. He learned from the Southern segregationists. He learned from the genocide of the indigenous in the West. These were his reference points, or many of them. And so in that sense, the U.S. has the original kernel of fascism. And many countries, of course, also carried out in Germany and in Italy what they were already carrying out in the colonies abroad. And instead of kind of putting fascism in some very highly separate category for, good capitalism versus the fascist capitalism, we should understand how these things have always been circulating as ideas under the sort of norms of white supremacy in particular. The US has a very serious far right, and it's not just about these small little groups, but in the state itself, in the police and in the military. And as I said, we believe that the US judges, the right-wing judges, are using the original US Constitution to basically strip away democratic rights, the right to abortion this summer, an amazing counter-revolution in terms of democracy. And they have many more planned. And they won't be using Hitler's Germany as their reference point. They'll be using the US Constitution from the 1800s as their reference point. I don't think that the formulation of fascism versus anti-fascism is that useful for understanding the Ukraine conflict. I do think there's elements of truth. The Azov battalion apparently is on a tour of the United States right now, or some of their leaders are, which is just incredible. How the most fascist, white supremacist Nazi forces have been normalized by the West in the last couple months, in the last couple years. So it would be absurd to say that there's no truth to it at all. But I don't think this represents the central axis around the struggle. I think Russia has obviously stimulated itself far-right and fascist forces in some ways. It's cozied up to them, at least in many different countries. And we should not neglect that. We should not put on rose-colored glasses and say because they're fighting the Azov battalion, therefore they represent the anti-fascists. So, these are complex things. I think the anti-fascist reference point is very important for Russia, of course, given the Second World War. And it's a sort of our national rallying point, but we're not obligated as an international left to accept the framing of the Russian state on this question.
Hello, Ben. A bit more of a general but short question. What do you think is the role of the US working class for future world socialist revolution, considering the central place the US has in cultural, industrial, political terms? And how does the term of anti-imperialism help or rather not help in this sense?
The term anti-imperialism?
Anti-imperialism. Like you just problematized the term anti-fascism a bit, and I'll try to go into that with the same term, anti-imperialism.
Well, I think anti-imperialism is useful from the standpoint of it's right now. I associate it at least with those people who understand it's mostly associated with the U.S. dominated world order and those who oppose it. But I do think that anti-imperialism and multipolarity are not what we're fighting for. We're fighting for socialism, and multipolarity on a capitalist basis is not a way out for the working class. It actually could mean many more wars. The destabilization of the U.S.-based rules, if it just means now there are no rules, that's not exactly emancipation. So, I think we have to keep. We've been sort of involved within the anti-imperialist movement. There's a debate right now on this very issue: how much to sort of embrace multipolarity, and that usually correlates to how much one is willing to support everything that the Russian state does or China or the other countries, that we have a existential need to defend these other poles. And I understand that, and I do generally support that, but we risk sort of falling into a kind of stagism, a new form of stagism, which has a long history in Marxism, that we have to go through an extended stage of multipolar capitalism before we can arrive at socialism. When in fact, all the material prerequisites for socialism are here now. With climate change, we only have about 20, 30, less, 12 years to make socialism. We have to urgently have an economy run for people's needs and the planet's needs instead of profit. We need a planned economy as an urgent necessity for humanity. It's not just like, what do the communists want? Like, humanity needs a planned economy. Without a planned economy, we're leading to irreversible destruction. And I think that the U.S. working class will play a big role. We're actually optimistic because actually we don't have the same ideological baggage as perhaps the European left, because socialism is unknown in the United States. It's been a demonized word, but it's like we're basically telling people you were lied to about socialism. Socialism is nothing like what you've heard. And let me tell you what socialism really means. And actually, people will listen. in the US working class. A lot of people will listen, especially young people who didn't grow up in schools during the Cold War. I think in Europe, you have a different dynamic where people have lived through socialism, or their parents have lived through socialism, or there used to be very strong parties of the left that are now quite weak or don't even exist anymore. So there's sort of you're fighting that kind of problem. Whereas in the US, where it's almost like virgin soil, for especially among young people. So we're actually quite hopeful about the revival of socialism in the United States. And for us, the main way in which we could get sidetracked is if the US working class and the US left, to go back to the point that the brother made about sort of the pro-imperialist sections of the left, if this interest in socialism gets turned into an anti-Russia movement, into an anti-China movement, into an anti-Cuba movement, anti-Venezuela movement, it won't ever be able to become a revolutionary movement, because it will ultimately be hoodwinked. It'll be tricked at the decisive moments into supporting its own ruling class. So it's white supremacy and imperialism, not just white supremacy alone, but it's these major issues of global politics that are going to be decisive for the formation of revolutionary consciousness, not just class consciousness, but the need for a new system. Thank you.
Dear comrade, thanks a lot for answering all our questions, even those we didn't specifically ask about multipolarity and sageism, which I found very interesting also. And I think this has really shown that the debates are quite similar everywhere around. These are exactly the topics we are also discussing around here. And I think there's a lot we can learn from what you guys are doing. And I wish you all the best, a lot of luck in the upcoming struggles in the US. And I would like to ask everyone around here to give a large round of applause. And thanks a lot for your participation today.
Thank you. And I want to wish you a very successful Congress. Thank you.